Indonesia's incumbent president claims victory after early results reveal a comfortable lead. But his rival has cried foul, claiming widespread cheating. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Joko Widodo. Initial results from the world's largest presidential election are in. Indonesia's quick count of votes shows President Joko Widodo, known as Jokowi, clearly in the lead. But his longtime challenger, former General Prabowo Subianto, isn't conceding defeat yet. His team says it has evidence of cheating, and according to their own internal polling, they won. Final results won't be announced until next month, but Jokowi's supporters are celebrating, and world leaders have already begun congratulating him. So, will Jokowi now be able to deliver on campaign promises? We'll discuss that in a moment, but first, Natalie Perhonen has this update from Jakarta.
Jokowi has acknowledged the quick count, but he's also asked Indonesians to have a little patience because the Electoral Commission will be publishing its official and final results on May the 22nd. He entered this campaign on a series of pledges centred around the economy. One of the key ones, of course, was to continue to develop infrastructure across the archipelago. During his first 5 years in office, he's seen some massive projects through, including the building of highways, railways, ports and airports across the country. And for many voters, that was enough of a promise, enough of a pledge to give him another term in office. He's also said that he will deliver millions of new jobs. That was perhaps a promise for some of the younger voters. Millennials made up about 40% of the voting population here, and so the chance for them to get full employment, to be able to have enough money to gain their own independence, was certainly seen as a draw card for many of them. As the quick count stands now, Jokowi has quite a lead over his rival Prabowo Subianto. So the numbers indicate he does have widespread support across Indonesia. But they don't reveal that at times this was a deeply polarizing campaign. And one of the reasons for that was the role of religion in this campaign. When Joko Widodo chose Maruf Amin, the highly influential and some would argue most powerful cleric in Indonesia, as his running mate, it was seen as a turn-off for some voters, particularly from minority groups, but also from Muslims who didn't want to see such a prominent religious figure put into a position of political office. That means that creating a sense of inclusivity once again could very well be one of the major tasks, one of the first tasks, in fact, for Joko Widodo when the next presidency is due to start in October.
That was Natalie Perhonen there for us. Let's bring in our panel now from Jakarta. I'm joined by Rukyan Adibrata. He's an advisor to the Indonesian government and an expert in counterterrorism. Greg Barton is a professor of global Islamic politics at Australia's Deakin University. And Shoaib Kagda is the founder of the Indonesia Economic Forum and a former editor of the Jakarta Globe. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Full disclosure, for the record, we had a Prabowo supporter booked for the show who pulled out. We tried to get a replacement. It was very difficult for us. We tried very hard. So that's unfortunate. Shoaib, the last time we spoke, you said that Indonesian people are not idiots. Even though there was a lot of fake news out there, they would not be swayed by it. There was a torrent of lies, especially on social media. What does it say that the person who was most heavily affected by the fake news, Jokowi, still, it seems, managed to get the trust and the vote of the majority of Indonesians? What does that mean, Shoaib?
Well, it clearly means that, voters have taken President Joko Widodo's promises to heart. They have not been swayed by the fake news campaigns and rumors that have been swirling around the country over the last 2-3 weeks. As I said, I think voters understand what this election is about. They have put their interest forward in terms of what they would like. We mentioned jobs. President Joko Widodo is promising millions of new jobs. Of course, we'll have to wait to see how those jobs are created in an economy, especially, I think, where growth at 5% is clearly not enough to create the 2 million new jobs that are required every year.
Rakian, Joko Widodo over Prabowo Subianto. What was the crucial ingredient in his recipe that seems to have given him the job again?
One thing for sure, I believe what he promised can be delivered in the last 5 years, even though it's not a perfect thing, but still, it's still categorized as acceptable to among of the people, of the voters living in Indonesia.
A lot of people, Greg Barton, who support Prabowo are refusing to accept this for now. Has there been any evidence whatsoever that there was cheating?
There's been evidence of minor irregularities. There were papers turning up in Kuala Lumpur, complaints of getting into polling booths in foreign stations, the expected problems in remote provinces like Papua, but no evidence of any large-scale or systematic fraud. The system seemed to work pretty well. It's as robust and as efficient as you can imagine in a country of Indonesia's scale and challenges. And I don't think there's any reason to be doubting the results.
Okay, Shuaib, as Natalie had mentioned and as we had spoken about before, at the heart of the division in a very divisive electoral campaign was the concept of what does it mean to be religious, I guess, as an Indonesian, and Islam and the role of religion in politics. Are we any closer to solving that riddle now that it seems as if Joko Widodo is the next president or the president has got another mandate?
Well, now that President Joko Widodo has more or less clinched the presidential elections, and his running mate is a Kiai, who is the head of the Muslim Religious Council in Indonesia. I think a lot of people and observers and Indonesians are going to watch exactly what role will the vice president play. Traditionally, the vice president has been the champion of the economy, while the president has focused his attention on the larger issues, especially on poverty reduction. And, in the last 5 years, of course, Joko Widodo has been very focused on infrastructure. Now, the other key role that a vice president normally plays is to try and sell the president's vision and programs in parliament. So again, how effective will this current vice president, Maruf Amin, be in that role? So I think the jury is out in terms of whether or not Islam has been laid to rest in this election. I'm really curious to see how much of a role will this current vice president play. And what would be his main agenda? Because in the past, he has talked about promoting a Sharia economy in Indonesia. What does that mean exactly? No one quite knows. But with him there, this whole idea, I think, is going to be raised again.
Right, Rakian, what do you think Maruf Amin's agenda is, and how big of a role will he play?
Maruf Amin is the most important clerics and also the head of the ulama councils, the Islamic ulama councils in Indonesia. For sure, the plan of Mr. Jokowi is to involve the moderates, the Islamic moderate society, especially the Nahdlatul Ulama and also the Muhammadiyah, two most of prominent Islamic mass organizations, to play the role in enhancing the cooperations and enhancing the role in countering radicalisms and violent extremisms in Indonesia.
Is violent extremism a problem right now, Rakian?
For sure. Well, if you see, for example, the rise of conservatism can run into a different, it can go the other way around and can create problems if cannot be nurtured very well.
Okay, so how is Jokowi's leadership of the past few years perhaps failed in addressing that and failed in putting an end to the root causes of violent extremism?
Well, there is no terrorism without radicalizations, and the seed of radicalizations is intolerance, even though not all intolerance can be radicalized and not all radicalized can be a terrorist. But one thing for sure, with the rise of conservatism in Indonesia, and it being used rapidly by violent organizations, including the radical organizations, to spread their narrative, it will be really difficult if the governments, if the next presidencies cannot enhance the cooperations with the mass organizations, moderate mass Islamic mass organizations such as Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. That's where the role of Vice President elected Ma'ruf Amin can play along really well.
Okay, so Greg, these things are complicated issues, and it's easy to sort of quote mine and just presume that a comment here or a fatwa there might necessarily mean extremism. But do people have reason to be concerned if they look at the timeline and they look at the track record and they say, well, the guy who's going to be the vice president has issued fatwa or fatwas in the past against yoga and against gay people and so on, so that perhaps might suggest that the government will be moving in a certain direction?
Well, they should be concerned about that past track record, but I don't think they should assume that it means the government and the president's moving in that direction. Ma'ruf Amin was not Jokowi's first choice. It was foisted upon him because party leaders didn't want the man that he wanted. But to be fair to Ma'ruf Amin, he's moderated his views and performed well since the nomination. I don't expect him to be a spoiler or an upsetting influence in the government. I think the fact that he's not just there for himself or even for the Council of Ulama. He's there representing Nahdlatul Ulama to a large extent and the larger Muslim communities. And I think that will moderate what he does. So I'm cautiously optimistic, although I think we should always be concerned about the rise of identity politics. It did play a role in this election, but the world's most populous Muslim nation has shown itself a successful democracy, 5 elections in 2 decades. And I think, to give it credit, we should be optimistic about its capacity to deal with these things.
Yeah, so Shoaib, is it robust enough? Are there checks and balances at play here between the competing forces of pluralism and ultra-conservatism?
Yes, I think there are checks and balances. I think civil society in Indonesia has also come a long way. People are not afraid to speak up. If you watch closely social media, pushback on many of these fatwas that you just mentioned against yoga and against the gay community, there has been pushback. One other point that I would like to raise in terms of growing extremism, and this is where Ma'ruf Amin could play an interesting role in my view, is to stop foreign funding of radicalized madrasas within Indonesia.
Where's it coming from?
And we all know where that money is coming from. That money is coming from Saudi Arabia. And, you know, when the king visited Indonesia recently, the red carpet was laid out for him. I would want to know what is Ma'ruf Amin's point of view in terms of stopping this foreign funding into madrasas in Indonesia, especially into schools where they teach Wahhabism, which is one of the main, in my view, one of the main causes of the growing radicalization of Islam in Indonesia.
Okay, so Rakian, given that this is up your alley, it's within your domain of expertise, do you draw a straight correlation between the Saudi funding of madrasas and mosques and so on, and a Salafi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, and radicalization?
Well, one thing for sure, the narrative that being spread out by the takfiris, the people who use terrorism as a tool to convey their message, they are indeed have a Wahhabism and Salafist influence on their narrative. But if we trace down whether it have a direct relations between terrorism in Indonesia with Saudi Arabia or the rise of radicalizations, I believe that's another thing that we need to discuss more further.
Okay, Shoaib, now beyond voting for the presidency, the numbers are extraordinary here. 250,000 candidates for more than 20,500 legislative seats at 5 levels of government, right? So it's not just about 2 guys jostling for a position here. What should we know about the rest of this massive election, the parliamentary elections? What are the trends that we should be aware of?
Well, yes, the parliamentary elections, in fact, kind of got subdued in these elections, but they were very critical because depending on which parties win enough votes to form enough seats in parliament will also determine the next coalition government because Jokowi and PDIP, which is the party that supports him, will not have enough seats to form a government. So there will be a need to form coalitions. In the past, that coalition has included Golkar, which is, of course, a Suharto era party, but which is trying to reform itself. Nasdem, the National Democrats, some of the Islamic parties have also thrown their support behind Joko Widodo. So I think the parliamentary makeup and the commissions that are formed and who runs these commissions will be very critical in terms of how policies are dictated over the next 5 years.
Greg Barton, is coalition building going to be a messy process?
Less so than in previous years. We've seen a move towards a more stable two-coalition system and two-presidential contender system. It's much less the messy multi-party democracy that it was even 5 years ago. It's interesting that the radical Islamist parties have not increased their share of their votes significantly. That's on the side of Prabowo. We have stability on the coalition that Ashok's just outlined that will support the president. So that augurs well for stability. I think that Indonesia is moving away from the really chaotic years in which party alliances and coalition memberships swung around at short notice to something that's going to be much more stable now.
Okay, do you agree with that, Rakian?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Tell me what makes this time different. Has there been a maturity, a newfound maturity in 2019 to this process of parliamentary elections, especially, in your opinion, Rakian?
Well, currently, if you compare with the previous 5 years, when Joko Widodo controlled the presidentials and sit as the president of the first time in Indonesia, he hasn't got any strong support from numbers of party. But comparing with right now, he already secured numbers of prominent parties like Golkar, PKB, and numbers of more. And I believe it's going to be a stable government in the next 5 years.
Shoaib, what kind of foreign policy can we expect? Closer to China, perhaps?
That is a good question. I think, Joko Widodo has actually come under quite severe criticism about getting too close to China. That again, but China is one of the major funders of his infrastructure program. So it will be interesting to see how his foreign policy shapes up. I think traditionally, Indonesia has also had very strong ties with the United States and with the West to a certain extent. But in the past few years, Western economies and especially Western companies have not been big investors in Indonesia. So going forward, I'd be interested to see how he woos foreign investors, because I don't think the Chinese alone will be able to boost economic growth and achieve the levels of foreign direct investments that Indonesia needs going forward.
Okay, Greg, so it seems as if Indonesia is less of a political football or economic football between the West and China, because the West, as Shoaib says, hasn't been that interested in recent years. Is that then naturally, does that naturally mean that Indonesia should be turning and leaning on the Chinese?
No, it doesn't. I mean, this is one of the big challenges facing the new Jokowi government. Indonesian economics, investment climate has been excessively nationalistic. Indonesia has quite reasonably been cautious about Chinese direct foreign investment and has one of the smallest ratios in the world. So despite the criticism against Jokowi, actually the Chinese don't have a large footprint. I think it's reasonable for that footprint to grow, but I also think there needs to be more investment from global investors around the world, but they need to have their confidence built by some degree of reforms to labour laws and some degree of reforms to foreign investment laws. Every country should be cautious about foreign investment, but in the Indonesian case, the balance has gone too far in one direction for some decades now. There's no great reason for believing that Joko is going to bring it back suddenly, but he's got the mandate and the stability to bring it back to the centre, and that's what he needs to go well above the 5% plus growth that we've been seeing for the last decade.
Right. So, Shoaib, there's a 5-year mandate, but you know better than I do how it works on the ground. How much time would the people give Joko Widodo before they feel restless and they feel like he's not doing the job that they elected him to do?
Well, he's had 5 years, so people have given him, I think, the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, even though he has not fulfilled a lot of his initial campaign promises. I think in this second round, and this is just my pure personal view, he probably has about 2 years to deliver, because after which, the clamor for the next elections will start, and in 2024. There will be a whole new slate of candidates coming forward, and many of them will be starting to position themselves, and some of them will be in the Jokowi government too. I know a few of them are already having an eye on the next elections and will be running as candidates now, which would then mean if they are in his cabinet, would they be just following his agenda, or will they be starting to create their own agendas and positioning themselves? So I think there's a 2-year runway here.
Okay.
For the president to deliver on his promises.
It's been really great getting a deeper understanding of Indonesian politics with all three of you. Shoaib Khagda, Greg Barton, and Rakan Adibrata. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Up next on the Newsmakers, leaders of Hong Kong's umbrella movement have been found guilty and could face 7 years in jail. Are the authorities going after democracy activists on behalf of Beijing? And this human rights advocate spends half his time criticizing Hamas. So why is Israel about to deport him? We'll ask him after the break. 9 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong have been found guilty for their role in mass protests in 2014 that called for freer and fairer elections. They were convicted on charges of public nuisance and are set to be sentenced next week. It all began as a movement calling for less political interference from the authorities in mainland China. So, almost 5 years on, what, if anything, did those protests achieve? In a moment, we'll debate that as one of Hong Kong's jailed protest leaders goes head-to-head with a defender of Beijing's rule. But first, this report by Abu Bakr Shamahi.
People in Hong Kong are able to protest like this because of the territory's one country, two systems policy. Even though the former British colony returned to Chinese control in 1997, Hong Kong has its own laws and locals have more civil liberties than the Chinese mainland. But these protesters are worried that, slowly, that autonomy is slipping away. The 9 activists at the front have been found guilty of public nuisance by a Hong Kong court for their part in 2014 pro-democracy protests. They could now be sentenced to up to 7 years in prison, but they're defiant.
Many people today, with me together, will continue to strive for Hong Kong's democracy and will persist on and will not give up.
Benny Tai was one of the leaders of the 79-day sit-in, which became known as the Umbrella Movement. Protesters took over streets across the city and used umbrellas to shield themselves from pepper spray and tear gas. They were calling for universal suffrage, where everyone in Hong Kong could vote for any candidate who wanted to run. Currently, candidates need to be pre-approved from Beijing, and only a small committee elects them. Beijing was opposed to the protests and has backed the verdicts against the activists.
The central government firmly supports the Hong Kong Special Administrative Regions government to punish, according to the law, the main organizers of the illegal Occupy movement. I also want to remind people from other countries who hold a one-sided view that the verdict was indicative of shrinking freedoms in Hong Kong, that is illogical and baseless. Just look at the situation in other countries, and you can draw a fair and unbiased conclusion.
Opposition activists are also fearful of efforts to make it easier to extradite people from Hong Kong to China. The protesters here include a former bookseller who said he was abducted and taken to China for selling books that were critical of the Chinese government. The fear is that any attempt to make extradition easier would see people from Hong Kong prosecuted in China for being critical of Beijing's leadership.
Perhaps in the worst scenario, activists might be jailed in mainland China, even they are permanent Hong Kong resident. We just realized that how the extradition law is not only affecting citizens in Hong Kong, but also affecting any businessman or tourists that travel or exist in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong's government says the proposed new rules are necessary to allow a Hong Kong man accused of killing his girlfriend in Taiwan to be extradited there. They've led to a furious response from opposition politicians. But as two systems slowly seems to be merging into one, do they have much hope of stopping China's grip on Hong Kong from tightening? Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Joshua Wong. He's the Secretary General of Demosisto, a party advocating for Hong Kong's self-determination. He served jail time for his role in pro-democracy protests. And in Beijing, we have political analyst Chu Kin-duo. He's a former correspondent for China Radio International. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Joshua, as someone who had time in jail for his activism, and now you've seen these 9 convictions over people's involvement in the umbrella movement, do you believe authorities are doing all they can to crush your movement?
Fight for democracy under the pressure of Beijing is kind of long-term battle. We have no regret at all, but it's really a hard time for us.
Are you certain that this pressure is coming from Beijing?
Absolutely, that's the pressure from Beijing, and under the hardline policy of President Xi Jinping, they just erode on freedom, human rights, and autonomy of Hong Kong. Even we are kind of city under the rule of Beijing, Hong Kong people deserve democracy. We deserve the right to freely elect the leader of our city.
Chu Kin-duo, this is from Beijing. This is not from the Hong Kong courts, according to Joshua. What do you think?
One thing Hong Kong people take a pride in is their rule of law. So if you look at the decision, including Joshua Wong's imprisonment and also the latest trial and the sentence from the court, few people would dispute with the court ruling the decision because people respect the law. That's very important to the order and the stability of Hong Kong. And of course, for people from different sectors of the society, they have different pursuit, a different demand. That's natural. That's just a plurality of the reality of Hong Kong. But I think basically everybody agrees the importance of the rule of law.
Joshua?
I would say that the judicial system of Hong Kong now is certainly recognized as kind of sugar-coated rule of law. Especially the government just prosecuted 9 leaders of the umbrella movement by the former colonial era law, which have strongly criticized by the United Nations, violate on the principle of human rights and rule of law. So if the government fully recognize the value and the principle of rule of law, they should not use this kind of outdated law to target leaders of the movement and just to generate kind of chilling effects.
Chu Kin-duo, it's the public nuisance law. It's a colonial era law, right? Would you agree that it's quite heavy-handed, Chu?
Well, this is a law. This is a legacy of the United Kingdom. You say Hong Kong was once ruled as a colony for nearly 100 years. So one thing also very noteworthy about the United Kingdom is about their rule of law and being a democracy. But speaking of democracy, before Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997, there was no democracy. The governor was appointed by and sent from London to Hong Kong. There was no such a thing called democracy.
Okay, but even
Democracy
the court. Okay, but
developed
Shu,
after
even
the
the court
handover.
is suggesting that there is no universal suffrage. It's even in their verdict. Let me ask Joshua about this, because the court said, quote, Joshua, it was naive to suggest that a concession to introduce the form of universal suffrage could be made by the government overnight with a click of the fingers. The court saying, you guys are naive, you want democracy, you can't have democracy. So what's your response to the court?
Which imply that the judges provide his personal political view during the judgment. And when the court need to make and announce the leaders found guilty or not, it should be just based on legal principle instead of political judgment that is unnecessary, exists, and announced. But one point I would like to add is when the judges criticize or recognize how naive the 9 leaders were, it's just show that how the judges also agree that the government do not respect and do not hear the voice of people.
Right.
Otherwise, they will not recognize this kind of naive attitude. The government should respect the voice of people.
Joshua, we heard Wang Zhimin, Beijing's man in Hong Kong, say some countries with ulterior motives want to use Hong Kong as leverage against China. And he was suggesting that you guys on the streets, you're being used by outside forces. Address that for me, Joshua.
That's the criticism from the pro-Beijing camp. They claim that the iPhone hold and used by student activists are funded and purchased by US government. This kind of unnecessary criticism, or even newspaper claim that I am trained by US Marine or I am appointed as one of the CIA agents. So I would say that this kind of fake news violate on the principle of press freedom and also kind of it's really contradicting with the reality. I just hope the international community recognize that Hong Kong as kind of international city, people should respect their different voice. Even foreigners live in Hong Kong, their voice must be heard.
Okay, so Shu, I know you can see Joshua there. And Joshua, I don't mean to disrespect your physique in any way, but Shu, you can clearly see this guy's not trained by the US Marines, right? These are crazy conspiracy theories.
Of course, you know, my judgment, which could be wrong, but I believe this is right this time. Joshua obviously is not trained by CIA. I think that's fake news. I agree with Joshua here. Obviously, he's not trained by the CIA. But remember, the thing is, like when the judges talked about being naive or naivety, I think he has a very good point. That is, whatever demand you have or justifiable it is, you cannot achieve it. It's impossible to achieve it overnight. At the same time, as we said, there are different voices in Hong Kong that reflects the democracy to a certain, a large degree. There are different voices. It's just natural. There are some voices that support the government, against the government, to prove Joshua Wang's camp or against his camp. That's just natural. And of course, when Beijing, people accuse this pro-democracy so-called camp here, like being used by other governments. That is being used does not mean like you're aware of. Okay. Sometimes you're not aware of.
Okay, so let's ask Joshua to respond to that. Joshua, you might be being used, but you don't know.
What I mean is, firstly, the judges claim that we are naive, and I would say that no matter people recognize that we are passionate or not, or we are naive or not, I think this kind of discussion is related to kind of political judgment or strategy discussion during the democracy movement. And I think that no matter we are naive or not, it should not be recognized as a criteria to consider activists or leaders found guilty or not. At the same time, people might worry that we might be used by others. But as the one born a year before the handover, what we ask for is we hope to ask for free election. People hope to be the master of their own house. When we have sense of belongings to our city, we just ask that, the leader of Hong Kong named chief executive. So how come we can't freely elect him or her? And it's just kind of small circle election with political censorship. And finally, the leader or the government is still appointed by Beijing. I would say that now Hong Kong is not colony of China. We are not under the rule of British government. So now when we are already under the rule of Beijing, it is possible for us to elect the leader of our city. What's wrong for 7 million people? Deserve the right to show that we can decide who to lead our city.
So, Shu, when you have this perspective, Joshua's saying we're not calling for something extraordinary. We just want to be able to choose our leadership. And then we have news that Hong Kong is planning to change its extradition laws to make it easier to send people to China at China's request. It seems that there's an inevitability that they feel that Beijing just wants to swallow them up and take away all of the freedoms that they have. It's the reality, isn't it, Shu?
Look, Hong Kong has played a critical role in China's opening and reform process to the outside world, or in China's great achievement to modernize the country. Over the past 40 years, China has become from a poor country to the second largest economy. I think everybody agrees Hong Kong plays its dual role. So it's a door to the mainland, to the China, the big country here. So Hong Kong is very important. Why should Beijing, why should the central government wants to do something stupid as destroy Hong Kong or taking the freedom from the people of Hong Kong? For Beijing, we would rather leave Hong Kong alone, manage your own business. Besides, let me respond a little bit to what Joshua has said about election. People do have election. People do elect their leader. But according to the mini constitution of Hong Kong, that is, the leader will be approved by Beijing, the central government. That's part of the law. That's respect the law. And their demand, of course, why they are trialed is not for they have all kinds of whatever demand. Is because their behavior violated the law, and they should receive due punishment when you violate the law. That's why Hong Kong is Hong Kong. That's why Hong Kong is envied by many other cities in Asia or in the world, because there's a rule of law, there's an order, there's a prosperity, there's a freedom, right? Why should anybody want to destroy Hong Kong at all?
Joshua Wong.
I mean,
let me ask you, Joshua, just for a second, address the extradition laws and the proposed changes to that. Address that first and then have the rest of your response.
We recognize the uniqueness of Hong Kong with judicial independence, and also free market economy. Especially, we have kind of check and balance and transparency in our market operation. But now, currently, the extraditional amendment proposed by Hong Kong government is just allow Beijing or mainland China government to freely arrest anyone from Hong Kong to mainland China and extradite that guy from Hong Kong to mainland China when the chief executive agree on it. And I think this kind of amendment should have more and more discussion in Hong Kong instead of just having 19 days of consultation, even less than 3 weeks. And it should have more public discussion. And I would say that instead of expecting Hong Kong apply the model of China, I think mainland China should apply the model of Hong Kong. Of course, we recognize that according to the mini constitution of Hong Kong, the chief executive should be approved by Beijing. But the question that finally is still asked by every Hong Kongers is, it is possible for us to go inside the voting station to vote the one we support during the chief executive election instead of only 1,200 upper class elite, and most of them belongs to the pro-Beijing camp. They become the significant minority. The 1,200 people, they might be the only one can elect the leader of city currently.
Right, so Shu, I know that as you listen to Joshua, you don't find what he's saying unreasonable. So what's the difference between what he's saying to you now on Skype and what he's saying with 10,000 other people out on the streets? They're not harming anybody, they're not hurting anybody, they're just asking for more rights. That's all they're doing.
Nobody has any problem with what they are asking for. There are different people asking for different things. Pro-establishment people would say, we are fine. We are going to take a gradual approach to achieve full democracy or direct election in the city. So some people say that's the approach we should adopt. Other people, like Joshua Wong, would say, no, we want the direct democracy overnight. So that's why the judge
But yeah,
says
the problem is those who are saying we want
and
direct
also,
democracy are getting thrown in jail. That's
look,
the difference, right? It's not that there's
no,
a sort of equal treatment
got,
of the different opinions.
Let me correct you. You are wrong in saying that because they are asking for such a demand, such a democracy, and then they are put into prison. Because what your behavior is not about what you are demanding, what you are saying.
Where
is about
should you
your
demand
behavior,
it?
what you are doing.
But where should you demand it? If not out on the streets peacefully?
No. There is a law. You can ask for approval. You cannot create this trouble for public order. You disrupt the people like 450,000 people's daily life for more than 3 months. You paralyze the whole city, and then you say, hey, I'm fine with this. But other people would say, I'm not fine with this. I'm pissed off with this. So where is the law? If there's no law, Hong Kong will become chaotic. Is that really the interest of the people in Hong Kong?
Joshua Wong, very finally, what's your message to the chief executive?
I urge the chief executive of Hong Kong recognize that people ask for democracy, no matter people around Hong Kong, around the world, agree or disagree, they still rely on the principle of peaceful and non-violence. And especially, I hope to point out that even we expected might face certain kind of prosecution by the government. But I hope people around the world could reveal that is the prosecution of government include any kind of political consideration, and is they are the one who hope to solve the problem, or just targeted the one hope to solve the social conflict. Yeah.
Joshua Wong and Shu Kindwo, I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Israel is set to expel Human Rights Watch's director for Israel and Palestine from the country. Omar Shakir is accused of promoting the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or BDS. An Israeli law enacted in 2017 states that any foreigner who knowingly issues a public call for boycotting Israel can be subjected to deportation. Human Rights Watch rejects the accusation. Now, Shakir is no stranger to controversy on our show, and he has often found himself being accused of bias from all directions. Take a look.
Omar uses the words international law and has very little understanding of what he's talking about.
I don't have the names now. I don't have the names.
You'll see names throughout the report
why
of individuals
did you ignore
who were
the reports
detained
of the
their
ministry, Mr.
criticisms.
Omar?
These are cases that are well documented.
He's working for some other political agenda.
This is not a policing situation, Omar. This is a situation of international terrorism.
So joining us, quite possibly for the last time from Ramallah, you never know, is the man himself, Omar Shakir, still the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. As our viewers would have seen, Omar, Hamas doesn't like you very much. The Israelis don't like you very much when you criticize them. You've been in this position where people tend to use your research when it comes to the other side and find it credible, but when it comes to their own, they question your credibility. Now an Israeli court is saying you support BDS. You're a boycott, divestment, and sanctions activist. Is it true?
The interesting thing, Imran, is that while they talk extensively about that accusation, the evidence that the government presented in court consists of my social media posts promoting Human Rights Watch's research on the activities of businesses in illegal settlements and our call on businesses to stop doing business in settlements because of the human rights impacts of those activities. This decision really sends a dangerous precedent because in essence, interprets the law that you mentioned to apply to the work of human rights groups documenting abuses of companies as we do throughout the world. It is the kind of quintessential work that human rights organizations do across the world. But really, this is about the effort of the Israeli government to muzzle a certain kind of advocacy. And in addition, it is about a court, and this is what really makes this decision chilling, putting its stamp on the government's targeting of a certain kind of advocacy.
Okay, so to be clear, you do call for boycotting those people who do business in illegal Israeli settlements under international law, but they're conflating it with calling for boycotts of all of Israel.
No, so neither Human Rights Watch nor I, as its representative, promote boycotts. Our mandate is to document rights abuses by all parties, including governments. So we call on governments to adhere to their human rights responsibilities under the UN guiding principles and not engage in activities that violate rights. We, through years of research, have found that if you're working in a settlement, there is no way to do so without being complicit in serious rights abuse. So we call on the company to stop that activity. We do not call on consumers to boycott any company, a company that operates in settlements or otherwise, because our work engages with governments and companies. And we take no position for or against the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, but we do support the right of individuals to express themselves nonviolently, including through support for boycotts.
Do you have the full support of your employer?
Absolutely. I think this is Human Rights Watch is a co-plaintiff with me in this suit against the government's decision in court. Human Rights Watch has said that my statements reflect 100% the positions of the organization. The organization has never repudiated any statement of mine. The reality is this isn't about me. It's really about the work that Human Rights Watch does and is reflective of a larger trend of the Israeli government seeking to squeeze and pressure human rights defenders, both international as well as Israeli and Palestinian.
You say this isn't about me. Reading one of the statements from the court, they say Shakir continues his actions publicly to advance a boycott against Israel, but it's not on the stages, at conferences or in university panels, rather through disseminating his calls to advance boycott primarily through his Twitter account and by other means. It sounds very personal for them. They're not saying Human Rights Watch does this. They're saying you do it. Don't you think that they're coming after you personally?
Look, this is just the latest version of what the government has been doing to Human Rights Watch for a number of years. You might remember 2 years ago in 2017, the Israeli government denied Human Rights Watch a permit to have any foreign employee. The argument then was that Human Rights Watch were propagandists for the Palestinian. That argument fell on deaf ears, and apparently at Netanyahu's behest themselves, they reversed, gave HRW a work permit. Then a year ago, the argument was that it was Omar promoting boycotts mainly based on my activism years ago when I was a student. They produced for the first time in Israel's history a dossier that they compiled on my activities going back to when I was a student at Stanford. And now, in 2019, their argument has been it's Omar through his work at Human Rights Watch promoting boycotts. It's just the latest failed attempt to try and muzzle Human Rights Watch, and we're not going to stand for it. And we're appealing this decision to the Israeli Supreme Court, and we will continue to do our work, whether I'm ultimately here or not.
Okay, take us through the nature of your appeal and what you'll be saying in that appeal.
Our appeal will look at the precedent that the Supreme Court has set as recently as October 2018 in a case involving Lad al-Qasim, a Palestinian-American student. The court made quite clear that the use of the amendment to the law of entry from 2017 should only be applied when a person is using their place in country to promote boycotts. Human Rights Watch, as we do in the nearly 100 countries around the world in which we operate, documents the rights abuses of companies in settlements and calls for companies to adhere to their human rights responsibilities. Quite simply, that is distinct from a political boycott call. But also, we will assert an argument that we made in court, that the law itself is unconstitutional because it essentially takes a form of advocacy, which has to do with that around Palestinian rights, and says it's not legitimate. The really shocking thing here is if you are in Israel and you call for a boycott for any other reason, say, for example, the labor rights abuses or having to do with the rights of Ethiopian Israelis, that's permissible, but they're saying that boycotts that have to do with Palestinian rights could be grounds to get you barred entry from the country, and this in a country that says it's the only democracy in the Middle East.
If May the 1st comes along and you're not successful, would you go voluntarily or would you wait for them to come and get you?
Look, we have throughout this time, adhered to the process and the rules and regulations that are in place. We intend to challenge this through the Israeli court system. We're hopeful that the Supreme Court will understand what's at stake in this decision. The first thing we're going to request is an interim injunction that will allow me to stay. until the court can hear the appeal, just as the district court has done. And we hope then that we will be successful in our appeal. So we intend to continue to, be here lawfully present, as I've been every minute of my time here. And we intend to exhaust the legal process. But ultimately, whatever comes out of the court, it's important to remember that the Israeli government at any point can change its mind, can decide that this is not the direction that it wants to go. And we call on Israel's friends in the international community to make clear its concern about the continued effort over multiple years. And they're not even disputing it. They're seeking to deport a rights defender over his peaceful expression.
And is it something specific to this Netanyahu administration that's very different?
There has been a difference. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a really concerted effort to go after rights organizations, right? We've seen it in different respects. With internationals, the most common tactic used has been denials of entry. We've seen that to Amnesty International, UN, prominent civil rights lawyers. When it comes to the situation in Israel, we see slander and all sorts of legislative measures to encumber the work of Israeli rights groups. And Palestinians get it the worst, facing criminal charges, arrests, etc. But it's all part of a sustained campaign. And this court decision is an escalation because it essentially sets a precedent that the court has endorsed the government's effort, which really, risks further shrinking of what little space remains. I think for human rights advocacy, that's critical of Israel's half-century-long, brutal and ugly military occupation.
Okay, Omar, we're following your case closely, and please keep in touch and hope to talk to you again very soon. Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.